All righty. Let's see if everything is working. Yes, it is. All right, excellent. I hope everybody had a good week and weekend. This week, well, the last couple weeks and then this week, we're all dealing with the time period between about World War One and the beginning of World War Two. It's all in the same area. And hi, Sarah. And one of the reasons is that a lot of the stuff that we see later on um, is reacting or responding to a lot of the visual vocabulary that's established during this time period. And I think it's really important to dig into a lot of this. And so there is quite a bit of overlap, and you'll see that, but we're also touching other things. And I think it was great. Grace, are you the one that did knows quite a bit about Russian constructivism?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because you made an observation a while ago about how it seems like a lot of different groups are addressing very similar ideas or concerns, and the way that they express that exploration varies with the culture that they live in. I think that's a really solid observation. So this week we are going to talk about Bauhaus, the architecture of the time, and surrealism. And we've already covered some of this a bit. One thing that we haven't covered is surrealism, but it all kind of fits together. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in just a short half an hour once I figure out how to do it. All right, here we go. Now this is a marionette that was designed. What elements can you see from it that make you think of some of the other uh, art movements that we've looked at? And what are those elements and why do they make you think of it? Uh, One example I'll give is with these legs and the arms, with that patterning, it really reminds me of Broadway Boogie by Pete Mondrian. So very much Distil kind of feel to that. Do you guys see anything else that makes you think of any of the other art movements we've looked at?
The wire mustache and beard and hair remind me of the Russian constructivism. They used material to show how that material works, and the copper, or I assume that's copper, or the wiring, um, it bends like that uniquely, and if you like bend it like that, it won't move unless you move it. So I think that's kind of reflected there.
I like that. That's a really good observation. How about you, Sarah? Is there anything that you recognize from any of the other things we've looked at?
Yeah, I think kind of the simplification of like the body forms remind me a lot of, I can't remember his name, but he was a Bauhaus artist that did like those like stage plays, and the way that he did costuming was just like oversimplifying and like exaggerating the human body. And I think that that just reminds me of that.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because this is a Bauhaus puppet, but it ties really solidly in with a lot of different movements. And you guys, your observations are really, really good. I like that. One of the what's it called? One of the intents when they were doing the costume design for dances and plays and things like that was to not necessarily hide the human form, but see if they could find opportunities to step away from the human form. Because they thought one of the rationales was by going to shared and simple geometry, you're removing things from the elements we use to drive each other apart. You know, it attracts a more universality of visual language. And I think your observations are really, really good. This all is happening right around World War One and while people are recovering from World War I. And there's an awful lot of stuff that's going on. At the turn of the century, we had all sorts of new technologies that were showing up that people were trying to use. I showed you that picture of the Paris exposition right around 1900, where they had an elevated train and they had all these and there's an observation here that I wrote, why it's interesting to me that people will respond differently. And some contemporaries to Bauhaus and stable, livable design responded to the same stimuli with Dada, which was meant to drive people towards questioning reality. And that all became the fairy godfather to Surrealism. And this was an upending of expectation, which engages viewers in a conversation about reality, mental health, and the rationality of any search for meaning. So this is a real exploration at this time of the meta, the bigger message behind the things that we actually experience. And it is interesting to me that every war that humans go through spawns both fanfares where people march and love songs. It's interesting how the stimulus itself does not direct response. The response comes because people choose how to react or interpret or respond to a stimulus. And I think that those are really important to remember. So I have a couple of videos. I wanted to show some videos about Bauhaus, some architecture, and then also surrealism. So we'll just deal with each of the stuff as we go through. So let's see, and before we watch the video, I want to show some imagery. And we've already looked at a lot of this. So a lot of this stuff, from my perspective today, this feels a little uncomfortable. But from the time period that people were living in when they came up with this stuff, a lot of this stuff really didn't become palatable for a lot of people for almost another generation. Like this teapot here that is made in 1924, this style did not really become super acceptable by a lot of people in the US until you start seeing things like this show up in the 50s and 60s over here in popular homes. This stuff is easily 20, 30 years ahead of its time. And some of the stuff never goes away. When you look at this chair, this MR armchair, have you guys ever known anybody who had something that looked just like that? I mean, almost everybody sees that, and they're still being made today. This kind of chair I've seen a lot of the time as a deck chair. It's called the Wassley chair because but it's made easily 100 years ago.
Sorry. That you put on there. No, what we see nowadays. In the because now like metal, everything, but like then like there were these revolutionary ideas, so it's so hard to like imagine then when they were like these revolutionary ideas, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a similar mindset or response to like when my grandpa would see something and say, "Well, anybody could do that." Well, yeah, anybody can, but there has to be a first. You know, and the constructivists as well as the Bauhaus and a lot of people at this time were using materials that were just coming on the market, that were just becoming available, and they were exploring things that today we would not want to use because it's difficult to use these materials responsibly. But at the time, things like bakelite and plastic were absolutely fundamentally revolutionary. And like you said, it's hard for us to wrap our brains around today because this is stuff that we see all the time. Like this photogram, I really like Mihaly Nagy. I Laszlo Mihaly Nagy was an incredible photographer, very experimental. Have you guys ever done the thing where you take the blue paper, you set it out in the sunlight with the stuff on it, and then when you wash it, that you get this blue on white image that's a sun print? Have you guys ever played with those? That's the kind of stuff that Mihaly Nagy really developed, that kind of imagery. And you can see that in this stuff, but somebody somewhere had to be first. First person who really did the cyanotype like that was actually a woman in Great Britain who was documenting plants that grew in ponds. And she was a super brilliant botanist that developed her own photographic technique in about 1850 that essentially we know today as sun prints, that she called them cyanotypes. But she did that specifically so that because she realized that when she tried to dry and preserve the plant specimens, they just would wither away and disappear. And Laszlo Mihaly Nagy was super brilliant. Now we see that today and we think, oh yeah, a kid can do that. Well, yeah, a kid can do that, but these are techniques that had to be invented by somebody and had to be used by somebody and had to be shown that they had a potential as an art form. And I think that's pretty remarkable. And of course, this chair, the B35 and the MR armchair are based on very similar principles, but this kind of tube steel was a brand new way of creating structure with very little cost and very little weight. And that's something we don't even think about today. When 5 years earlier, this would have been a solid metal chair. And that's the kind of thing that I hope people get away from this. And the Cuba stacking containers, right now you can buy a whole selection of these at any IKEA or Walmart or online. Anchor Hocking is one of the brands that's ubiquitous that makes this kind of stuff all the time. But that did not exist.
Exact.
What's that?
I have almost identical Tupperware to that right now.
Yeah, and it's all based on the Bauhaus style design concept, and that's one of the things that I just think is so astounding that we just take for granted today. So I want to share this video. Okay, it's a really short one. We have a couple that I'll watch. Some of these videos may have AI voiceover, and please do your best to endure it.
Is the video supposed to be playing right now?
Oh, yes. I'm not sharing it, am I?
No.
What is wrong with me? Okay.
I wasn't
I
sure
am
how
so
long we were
sorry.
going to sit in silence
I am
for.
so embarrassed.
Yeah, I don't know if you're just like trying to get it up.
No. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, give me a sec here. Okay. I thought you guys were quiet because you were in rapt attention. Okay, here we go. Well, I enjoyed the video, even if you guys didn't like it. Okay, here we go. Here we try again. Can you guys see this? Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Bauhaus movement began in 1919 and continued until it was closed by the Nazis in 1933. It's a movement that was a distillation of a lot of decorative arts and design elements into basic geometric forms. The movement started when Walter Gropius broke away from the state-owned academy in Weimar in 1919 and wanted to start an art school. And
Do you guys remember where you've heard that word Weimar before? Outside of Bauhaus? Remember 2 weeks ago we were talking about it? Hannah Hoch.
Her painting or her collage, the Dada
Yeah.
collage.
Yeah, exactly.
The basis for the art school was to really embrace the machine and to begin to prepare and make objects in all media for mass production. And the word Bauhaus comes from the German word bauen, to build, and house. And it was in its early stages, the Bauhaus was primarily more expressionistic. It was only in its later versions, when Walter Gropius moved the Bauhaus from Weimar to Dessau in 1923, that the designers who were primarily interested in a more distilled and geometric forms began to have the upper hand. The Bauhaus continued until about 1932 or 3 or so, when it was moved to Berlin, and then eventually there was an effort to continue the Bauhaus in Chicago as well, and it was in operation for about a year or two. At that time, it was administered by Mies van der Rohe and also Walter Gropius.
Well, and there's so that's a little bit of a history of it, and we looked at some of the items from it. And here's I have a couple of videos. Oh no, okay, that's not what I thought. Right. I do have a couple of videos, but we won't watch them all. Let's see. I'm going to try to expand this. Sorry, give me a second here. Okay, here we go. I want to watch this. I'm hoping. Did we already watch this? This one? Like about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago? Did we already see it? Because there was one that I showed that I thought was a lot shorter than this, that had similar graphics to it. But I didn't think it was this one. Was it this one?
I don't remember.
Okay. Well, if you've already heard it, and please speak up and let me know. But I'm pretty sure we have not watched this one before.
Historians, the Bauhaus is a symbol of modernism and artistic ingenuity. However, to the vast majority of people, the Bauhaus seems like a rather peculiar and short-lived German.
Okay, I think we did watch this before. What's really interesting about this, and we watched something very similar about De Stijl too. I recommend everybody see this again. A couple of things that are interesting to me is the attention paid to geometric detail and the attention paid to trying to find ways to demonstrate visual balance without leaning on established realistic precedents. Like this image right here is a landscape painting. The only way we know that is because we have this two triangles here that usually represent something like mountains or hills. Other than that, the whole thing is established to be an exercise in demonstrating informal balance with geometric shapes. And that's it. I think for the most part, one thing that is really important to remember is that a lot of these artists were trying to find ways. Oh, and this is where I was talking about where the costumes, they did what they could to go against expectations of the human form. So you guys probably saw these costumes. If you guys see any clips from the Paris Olympics, do you remember seeing costumes that were kind of like this? Did you guys ever see any clips of the opening for the Paris Olympics?
This year?
Just
Or,
the
sorry,
most recent.
before?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't watch like any of the opening stuff from this year.
Okay, because a lot of it is based on this kind of costuming design, where they're specifically trying to create costumes that were not restricted to elements of the human form. That's why we don't see elbows, we don't see knees, where the arms are sausages, the legs are sausages, the hips flare out, so you get this kind of confused form. And it looks more like a very simplified wooden doll than it does a human being. And that's on purpose, because by going away or intentionally going away from realistic expectation or to expectations of realism, as well as going away from expectations on specific human form cues and pulling in geometry, they're trying to find a way that was to create a universalist visual language that did not separate out individuals. Does this make sense? I'm trying to. It's difficult for me to explain. Like my kids tell me I have a brain like a pachinko machine, but what's going on is rather than creating a human form that everybody can identify as a man or a woman, or creating a human form like Soviet police created a call sheet of 30 different faces that they did so that of criminals throughout the Soviet Empire, so that police anywhere could identify who the criminals were by their hairstyle and facial features. They could tell which part of the Soviet Empire they came from. This person is from Tajikistan, this person is from Yugoslavia, whatever. And today, of course, we call that racial profiling. And what the Bauhaus artists were trying really hard to do is to avoid individualizing visual language, to make it so that it was more universal and comprehensive, so that everybody could participate.
Have you seen those jeans where the legs sort of go out? Sorry, that's my cat. The legs sort of go out into a bubble.
No.
They're kind of popular right now. Sarah, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, like barrel jeans.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think they're so ugly. I think they're the ugliest jeans.
Honestly, same.
But they're really popular right now, and they're like sort of a bubble right on the legs, sort of like what you're talking about with the Bauhaus. And there are these puffy jackets. Me and my wife call them Snoopy jackets because they're so puffy that like you can't find any form on people. And I think I know what you're talking about, like a sort of androgyny, like you can't find any sort of describable form. And I think it's really popular right now, like androgyny and like so big that like you can't make out any sort of form or like identity, that it's just sort of like, oh yeah, it's just a guy, just a person with like puffy clothes,
Well, and it's interesting to me because sometimes this can go, you'll get a similar effect that is led by a very, very opposite points of view. Like, for example, I was reading about what Mao said regarding the People's Revolution in China, that everybody needed to be treated the same, so everybody should look the same. And that's why uniforms didn't have distinguishing colors. You know, all the clothes were supposed to be the same color because he wanted everybody to dissolve into the same person. And it's interesting that perspective would lead to loss of identity, where the Bauhaus was trying to do physically things that were similar, but the way that they were doing it, their perspective was they wanted everybody to see themselves in it. They wanted it to be universally inclusive rather than completely dilute individuality. So you get, and it's interesting to me that you get some similarities and some parallels, where on the one hand, it was intended to remove individualism, and the other side, it was intended to be completely inclusive. I just think that that's really fascinating.
I think everything comes down to accessories. You know, how you accessorize and your creative spin on it. Like, obviously with uniforms, there's a conformity to it. So, you know, you can't really do a creative spin on that. But like with the Bauhaus, they were trying to explore their creative mind. And just like now, like with the stupid barrel jeans, their dumb creativity that I don't like.
Well, it could go a lot of different ways, but it's fascinating to me. You know, when we look at this stuff, and sometimes it feels like it's hard to understand. I think it helps to appreciate what time period people are talking about. You know, this is the time period that the Bauhaus came in. We're still talking about the Spanish Revolution, and this is why Picasso's life was almost constantly in danger because of his painting Guernica, where the Spanish leadership received a 2-mile artillery gun from Germany as a gift, and to test it out, he just picked a random town on the map and blew it to smithereens. And that town happened to be Guernica. So without warning, the entire village was completely wiped out. Children, women, and men, animals, everything, simply because the person didn't care about it, the people there. They just wanted to play with their new toy. And it's with that kind of a world, it's interesting to me that one of the perspectives would be, let's celebrate the fact that everybody's valid by creating something that everybody can find themselves in. You know, that universality. I just think it's really interesting. So here's another video that talks about the impact of Bauhaus, and then we're going to go on to other stuff.
Legs, elegant cane seated, rich birch wood. In Cheska.
It's like the right amount of creepy for this.
The Cheska, also known as the B-32, B-64 if it has arms, is kind of having a moment. Full disclosure, I am literally sitting on one right now. Have been since at least.
Okay, so this chair that she's sitting on, this is the one that was designed in 1925 originally as part of the Bauhaus, designed specifically to be a universally accessible chair, designed specifically to be mass-produced, but designed using principles of universal geometry so that everybody could find themselves in it. And they're actually pretty comfortable chairs. And then we get this teapot that was designed specifically with this kind of universal geometry. And you can see some of these things still. You see echoes of this today. And this chair, I mean, these are things that we can all find today. And you go to any IKEA or Walmart, and these are the things that people are still very much interested in. Maybe not the caning, maybe they have a little bit different perspectives, But I'm not going to leave the sound on. I'm just going to watch some of this, and you can recognize this kind of imagery from today. You know, they're still popular, but those sizes that they demonstrated. This kind of ties into what we're talking about next. This is prices, but these are the sizes. The sizes were specifically designed for livability. And I'll get more into that in just a second. Le Corbusier, who we'll talk about in just a sec, was really interested in this kind of stuff. The metal tubing remains kind of flexible. So when you sit in this chair, it's not a rigid experience. The caning was relatively simple to manufacture, so it could be mass produced with a weaving technology. And what's interesting about this particular design is the metal tube legs act almost like shock absorbers, and it becomes incredibly comfortable. And you can see the variations of it. I mean, it's still something that is very popular today. I think that really very interesting. But I wanted to share this. We don't have a lot of transition here, but I wanted to share something that we're blending into. Le Corbusier was one of the designers that was very much a part of the design world that the Bauhaus found itself in. And he was invited to India to help construct an entire, it was basically a town that was designed around, what's the word? Administration. You know, this was supposed to be a government official town. And so a lot of the things that he designed were supposed to be very modern. And the way that he created them was by applying those principles of universal geometry that in part the Bauhaus developed. Let's see. And we are going to look at okay, to understand what's going on with these guys, what we're going to do is look at fundamentals of architecture. And then we're going to see how people applied that universalist geometry of Bauhaus into architecture. And what we'll see is some stuff that looks very dated. But did anybody go get a chance to look at the Parade of Homes? All right. Did you happen to see any of the homes that were in the area right around the Red Rocks LDS Temple?
Mm-hmm.
That area.
Yeah, a couple.
And then there was also a couple that were way out by the airport.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see any of those?
Yeah,
Those were ultra modern homes, things that we see today that just, I told one person that I expected Tony Stark to walk around the corner. Ultra modern, but they're fundamentally come from this era of architecture.
Yeah.
It's still having that level of impact. What's that?
I'm actually doing the project that I'm working on right now is the Parade of Homes. So
okay, good.
See.
Excellent. Well, on this, let's see, so I want to watch, here's a couple of videos. These are about 2 to 3 minutes long, both of these. And they talk about Vitruvius. And the reason why this is important, Vitruvius was a Roman architect about 2,000 years ago, who one of his guiding principles was, since architecture is designed for human habitation, architecture must be designed in relative to the human form. And you can really see that very much so on medieval Christian architecture, where the buildings were designed specifically to be somebody laying down in with their arms outstretched, looking like Christ on the cross. And it's all based on the principles of design that Vitruvius talked about. But this is important because this ties in to what was going on in the minds of these architects.
After the defeat of the Persians by the Greek army, all of the men of a town called Karyai, who fought on the side of the Persians, were killed. Their town ruined and their wives were took into slavery. To mark these women as wives of the fallen men, the triumphant army forced them to keep their robes to be shamed and burdened by the wrongdoing of their state. The Caryatides, or the Maidens of Karyai as they were called, are still remembered to this day by the work of a Greek architect that reflected the sin of Karyai and burden of these women in his architecture. He placed them as statues to hold the weight of his public building, currently visited by more than 1 million tourists each year. The fall of Karyai is still remembered to this day due to the work of an architect that truly understood the importance of history. This story is taken from the first book on architecture, written by Vitruvius, who lived in the Roman Empire and was the architect consultant for both Julius Caesar and Emperor Augustus. In his book, he argued that the path of a successful architect should be based on several pillars. The first pillar is history. It's used to present the culture and the social behavior of the crowd, the state, and the civilization as a whole. As with the story of the Karyai, architecture is filled with long-lasting buildings, designed by architects who truly understood history. Art, drawing, and geometry is the second pillar to transform ideas into architectural shapes. Philosophy is another tool in the toolbox. The architect that studies philosophy can understand higher meanings and introduce even higher purpose to his shapes. At the time of the writing, understanding the ways of the gods was essential to build temples. However, philosophy can also help the architect to shape his own personality and to be honest in his designs. Physics give the architect the ability to interact with the elements and forces of nature, such as wind, earth, and gravity. Music, to represent a vocal interpretation of math and harmony. Both are pillars of architectural design. Theater, to show the architect knowledge to sound behavior and propagation. Law, to follow the state's rules and to avoid unnecessary conflict with neighboring lots. Medicine, to understand the human anatomy and the elements of our health that are crucial for the well-being of the buildings or city's occupants. And astronomy, to map out the sun path and to direct it into his buildings. Vitruvius was wise and clearly understood that any person will need a full lifetime to be an expert on any of these topics. However, as the architect that may have shaped architecture forever, Vitruvius asks his readers to know just enough to express the right judgment so they can create beautiful cities and to play a positive role in the creation of a happy and strong society.
And we're going to talk about this in just a second, as soon as we finish watching this other one.
Fundamental principles of architecture. Vitruvius. After laying out the path for being a successful architect according to Vitruvius in our previous videos, we will go through his ideas on the fundamental principles of architecture, as pointed out in his writings. Vitruvius believed that architecture depends on 6 principles, each with its own weight and value on the projects. The first one is order. He considered that a building is made out of small parts or modules, where the selection of these modules will give the building order and proper form. To lay out these modules, the architect will require what is called arrangement, or the process of laying out the ground plane, which is the outlines for the surfaces of the building. The elevation, to draw pictures of the building facades in detail. And perspective, for sketching the front of the building while projecting the sides into the background. To achieve good order and arrangement, Vitruvius asked the architects to rely on careful thinking, to pay attention to all the details, and to use innovation. The third and fourth principles are harmony and symmetry. These 2 principles are connected and each move the project towards beauty. A beautiful design should have its height suited to its width and length. Symmetry is the relational beauty between each element of the design. The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci is inspired by this concept. In order to explain symmetry, Vitruvius used the human body analogy, where harmony and symmetry are found between the forearm, foot, palm, finger, and all the other body parts. And the same concept applies to the perfect building. The last 2 principles are propriety and economy. While the first 4 foundations addressed form, these 2 are for the functional aspect of the design. A beautiful project that lacks a proper functional thinking is considered a failure. Propriety is respecting the context of the project, such as opening the top of the Roman temples to have a direct access to the heavens and their gods. This principle asks the architects to understand the usage and the location of their projects. And economy is about properly managing the project and using a balance between cost and common sense, where the ordinary home will be different than that of a wealthy man or statesman. Please let us know what you think of this video, and if you have a certain topic.
I think that those, it may be difficult to see right now how that fits in with our class, but those are really important principles to understand and appreciate, because those are the principles that drove these architects. And a lot of the times, the architecture that we see, many times the architects aren't consciously following Vitruvius's guidelines. But what is interesting to me is, like I spoke to some of the builders. There's a vineyard home out by past the Hurricane, and there was another one. Just it was that the vineyard home was on the far side of Hurricane and Laverkin, and another one that I saw was on this side of Hurricane, and I think there were numbers 16 and 11. And both of those homes, I got a chance to talk to the builders. And as I was talking to them, because those two homes I thought were really remarkable, because you walk in and immediately you feel like you had a sense of where the bathrooms were, where the kitchen was. You felt comfortable. It was exciting, engaging, and enticing without being too much. You could have moved in because it felt so comfortable. And I talked to the builders, and I didn't prompt them or anything, but they were talking about all these principles. Making sure that the shape of the room made the person using the room comfortable, that the size of things were suggested to their functions, but also didn't put a person off. It was just big enough to feel expansive and just small enough to feel comforting, and they had use of textures that was engaging without being extravagant or exorbitant. There was nothing there to shock and awe anybody. All of it was very specifically designed so that this was a home you could come home to and enjoy. But it was fascinating to me that these guys who designed these homes, about a year and a half ago, were following the exact same principles that we just heard about with Vitruvius. And Le Corbusier was somebody who he was a companion to the Bauhaus, but he split away from the Bauhaus and took his style in a slightly different direction. He became a little bit more functional, where the Bauhaus loved to really explore. Bauhaus practitioners, they ultimately were functional, but in the process of finding that functionality, they also explored things because they were fun. And Le Corbusier began that same kind of way, but towards the end of his career, he was a lot more interested in exploring the functionality aspects as opposed to the fun aspects. And there is a famous drawing. I'm going to see if I can find it really quick and show it to you. That Le Corbusier used to design his furniture, as well as, okay, here we go, as well as his buildings. So he would create these, this body art, and these were specifically designed as stand-ins for human form. And he would find out basically the size of the people that would be using what he was going to design, and he would create these geometric diagrams, and he would use this as the foundational measurements for everything about the home and the furniture. So you look at this, he would know exactly, so I'm going to enlarge this a bit. He would use this to figure out exactly where the seat of the chair would be, where the edge of the table would be, where the countertop would be, where how big the door frame would be. Yeah, this human form looks a little bit stylized, but that's because he's living in a time when this was groovy to do. But these ratios he used throughout, and it is based on golden section ratio, which I think we talked about. Do you guys remember what the golden section ratio is? It's 1 to 0.618. And it is the thing that when you look down the center of a DNA helix, this proportion is expressed in a five-fold geometry all throughout. The Nautilus shell demonstrates this proportion. But Le Corbusier did this specifically, designing it to follow along with what Vitruvius was saying, so that every aspect of the constructed environment was directly relative to the human form. And which, looking back, that does kind of make sense, but that it was revolutionary because before then people weren't paying a lot of attention to it. The very best furniture manufacturers for royalty and stuff would do this, but Le Corbusier was the first person that actually did this for everybody living anywhere. And so there's some of his buildings. And as we look at these, think about the kinds of buildings today that you see. Oh, I'm sorry, this ad showed up and I don't want it to, but hopefully we can still see some of these images. But as we scroll down and look at some of these, oh no, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to find something else now because it doesn't show all 15 of them. Okay. Oh, that's so disappointing. All right. I will be on the lookout for a better tab for that. But these videos are really important to watch as well because they talk about some of this. One of the things that was really sad is as the Nazis rose in power in Germany, and this is about 15 years after the end of World War I, is when they started their rise to power. When they started gaining power politically, they started shutting down people that disagreed with them or wanted to think differently. And so that's one of the reasons, that's the principal reason why the Bauhaus shut down, was because the Nazis did not like the idea that people were thinking creatively and universally. The brown shirts wanted everybody to think the way that they thought, which was not very inclusive at all. And so the Bauhaus was a threat. Now, Le Corbusier, his family was actually threatened by the Nazis, and he announced to the world that he was subscribing to their worldview when it came to design, and he shifted his focus. Over the years, people have really thought he betrayed the values of art, because the Bauhaus shut itself down rather than fall in line with the Nazi worldview, and Le Corbusier shifted his focus so he was more in line with it. What people don't realize is, quite literally, that was the only way that Le Corbusier could survive, because his life and his family was in jeopardy. And but what he did impacted architectural design ever since. Now we look at another architect, and this guy, we talked about him quite a bit before as well. And this was Frank Lloyd Wright. Remember, we talked about him in relationship to Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and the kind of American version of this. And Frank Lloyd Wright was active all through his entire life, building things. And some of these buildings are pretty amazing. What he did, he paid very close attention to the human form and those proportions, like Le Corbusier. but it's fascinating to me that his perspective looks quite a bit different. And we look at these homes, and you can see that kind of geometry that the Bauhaus had. And we talked a little bit about the steel and the planes that didn't quite connect with each other, and that universal geometry that invited people in. What Frank Lloyd Wright did that was a little bit different than that, yes, he did build some houses like that. But later on, getting closer to this time period that we're looking at, what Frank Lloyd Wright did was bring in elements that really tied the architecture to the people that were living there and the people that were building it. So he used a lot of references to the arts and crafts movement, which was designed specifically to use simple geometry to demonstrate what the craftspeople could do. So it's, instead of concentrating on modern materials use like the Russian constructivists, the arts and crafts movement really focused on what the individual craftsman could do. So there's a lot of natural wood, a lot of cedar, a lot of natural materials, or a lot of materials designed to look natural. And a lot of that influence got into the buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. And we look at like this kind of a building. Can you guys see the influence of Bauhaus geometry in that? Where do you see it?
Simple geometric shapes.
Yeah, there's a lot of rectangles, a lot of these repeating shapes and those windows going down. One of the things that was transformative for Frank Lloyd Wright was that he traveled to the Yucatan, and he saw a lot of Tlaloc-inspired Mayan architecture, and that just blew him away. And a big part of that was because it was distinctively American. The Tlaloc Maya architecture is unlike any decorative architecture anywhere else in the world. And he started putting that into his home. So instead of just staying with the raw geometry of the Bauhaus, Frank Lloyd Wright brought in diagonals and geometric abstract shapes that were based on the American prairie. That's why it's called prairie style. But he also brought in the Mayan architecture elements. That's what these tiles are. And this kind of slight diagonal, this is a reference to some of the angles in Mayan pyramids. And because that was also distinctly American. So he's doing something very similar to what the Bauhaus was doing, but in his architecture, he made it distinctly American by bringing in things that only existed in the Americas. And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
I like in the Hollyhock house how you can really see the Mayan like influence. I didn't know that he did that trip, but that I can now put those pieces together. That's really cool.
Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of like out of place looking at his other stuff. Like, I really like his Price Tower. Like, that's my favorite of his buildings. But now that I know that it's connected to, like, the Mayan American style, I like it more now.
Yeah, very cool. And if you go to the Red Rocks LDS Temple, you see a lot of that influence from Mayan architecture as well as, primarily Frank Lloyd Wright.
That was like one of the coolest things when I saw the temple, like the new temple for the first time, was like just looking up and seeing all those blocks up there. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool. I recognize those.
Yeah, the floral, the leaf shapes that are in there are not specific to the Mayan architecture, but the leaf shape coupled with that Mayan block kind of thing is very specific to the Frank Lloyd Wright interpretation. And the heavy square pillars, that kind of modular construction, it ties into those universal geometries that the Bauhaus used. And it's kind of exciting to see that. But since you've seen some of those houses in the Parade of Homes, do you recognize a lot of these shapes? Like right now on the screen, I have the Le Corbusier. Can you see the connection between that and that Frank Lloyd Wright geometry? what's going on there. And this is all of that same kind of time period. We're talking 1930 to about 1950 is that kind of range that we see this going on. And but Sarah, do you recognize these kinds of forms in some of those ultra modern homes?
Yeah, I think so. Especially like one of the things that like really they both did was kind of like bringing in a new concept of like negative space in architecture by having like all those overhangs and stuff that just kind of float above it. And that was one thing that I like specifically noticed, is just how common having those big, like massive overhangs in the top, in the roof lines, it was with especially like the ultra modern houses that were in there.
Yeah, yeah, very much. And I was watching something about towards the tail end of Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, that the name of the architecture shifted to mid-century modern, which is a period from post-World War II to about 1970. And there are some horrifically awful examples. And I don't want to share any of them with you because I don't want you to get vomit on the keyboard of your computers. There are some really, really bad examples. And just truly awful. But in Australia, for example, they brought architects were trained in Europe and the U.S. They saw a lot of the Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier design models. They were very influenced by the universal geometry of Bauhaus because of the accessibility of it. You know, the universal accessibility of it. They came back, and you see in any neighborhood that's over 50 years old in Australia, you'll see these absolutely beautifully constructed homes that look right out of this kind of model. And with you have those planes, you have a reaching to engage the exterior space. So you have backyards where you have a large overhang over the porch, but it's designed to feel like part of the home so that the porch is actually bringing in some of the outdoors into the body of the house. You have these kind of modular doors almost, so you can redesign the space a little bit. There's some flexibility, just like we saw in the I think it was the Reinhardt. Was it the Reinhardt or Schroeder house? I can't. But that house that we saw was a beautiful example of De Stijl and Bauhaus kind of influence. And it just, they're using the elements of Russian constructivism, where you're trying to make the most of the physical properties of the materials you use, and some of the most beautiful aspects of things like Art Nouveau, where you want to actually actively engage nature, and they're bringing it together into kind of this new visual language, where it's based on universal accessibility, where it's not a home that's designed for European immigrants. It's not a home that's designed for anybody from a specific background, but it's designed for everybody to get in and feel comfortable. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing. Well, and I wanted to, during this time period as well, while people are, the Bauhaus and the post-World War I architects were trying to find ways to engage people actively in participating in the lived environment. We get this throughout all this, there's this undercurrent of philosophy going on, which is really important because this ties into what Vitruvius was saying. And this philosophy is the same philosophy that has driven the expansions in the art world from about 1880. In 1880, that's when artists were really started giving themselves permission to express the world as they saw it, as opposed to limiting themselves to everybody's expectations of reality. This is where you start getting the Impressionists doing the dot and daub paintings like Monet, and this is where we get the Favists. We're just playing with color. The expressionists that are playing with texture, trying to share with you how they see the world. When before that time, everybody was trying to show you maybe their perspective on the world that you already saw, so you could recognize realistic things. And then we get to the Cubists, where they are asking you as an audience to engage with them in developing the meaning for the painting. They expect you to be smart. They expect you to carry on with them and communicate with them. And we look at people like the Dada artists, who, by going away from everybody's expectations, they were trying to engage an audience in asking what was important, what was real, what is valid, why do we even have nonsense like art? Which I think is a really good conversation for today. How could art have any relevance at all? And then it's interesting to me where we look at people that did De Stijl, Bauhaus, that are creating geometries not to remove humanity from the equation, but to create environments where everybody can feel like participants, where nobody feels excluded. And this all, I don't know if you guys ever see any of the Wade Wilson movies with Ryan Reynolds. What are those called? Deadpool. The whole series, I think, it's a fun comic book series, and it's a fun movie series where it's designed to help you be very aware that this is entertainment, and it's unreal, because he was one of the first comic book characters that, as part of the story writing, actively engaged with the audience outside of the comic book world. And this leads us to an idea called meta-awareness, where you're dealing with the stuff beyond what you're seeing. Have you guys heard of words like numinous or liminal? Have you ever heard either of those two things? Have you ever seen any of the videos on the yellow rooms? Do you know what I'm talking about? About, I want to say 10 years ago, there was a high school kid that started playing around with digital video making, where they're realistic looking animations. And he developed this thing that kind of generated its own cult following, and now it's its own world on YouTube. And he was exploring this idea of the yellow rooms, the spaces in abandoned malls or abandoned hotels, where the idea that you take a wrong turn as you're going downstairs and go into just a maze of yellow rooms that look like they're out of date. There's no other person around. Have you ever heard of any of this?
Yeah, like the back rooms, like.
Yeah, the back rooms. Yeah, exactly. Those are explorations of what's called liminal spaces, the spaces that are on the edge of understanding. Heimdall was a Norse deity who was the safeguard of liminal spaces. These are doorways, hallways, passages, the areas you travel through to get from one point to another point in your life or your awareness. And then there's also something called numinous or noumenal. Have you ever heard of that? This describes the idea that there are things that are just beyond articulated awareness, where you know they're there, you can feel them there, but you can't really point to it because it's not quite there. You just feel it, and you can't quite put it into words. The numinous presence, if you've ever had an experience going into like a haunted house, and you feel the presence that seems to be there, those kinds of things are numinous presences. Go into like an old area where you feel the weight of the history around you. Like if I go to, a lot of times I go to a national park. If I get far enough away from any human activity so I can't hear anything, I start feeling that weight of history. And you're going to Europe, same kind of thing. Going to areas here in the Americas that people lived in 1,000 years ago and nobody's around anymore, you get that same kind of feel. Well, both of those come into play in this next kind of thing that we're going to be looking at. And I started mentioning this video that I want to watch. We didn't look at it when we started talking about what art means, but I do want to watch it now. Those things that I just mentioned, numinous feelings or liminal spaces, have an awful lot to do with surrealism. And this Magritte was the artist who painted this. He was a psychologist, and one of the things that he wanted to do was try to express those ideas that are outside of easy expression through the art that he was doing. And this ties directly into what we've been talking about because it's related to phenomenology, but more than that, it's related to how people were trying to reevaluate their relationship with the world after World War I. You know, World War I represents a turning point where everything that everybody could depend on essentially fell apart. What do you have to depend on anymore? You know, the Dadaists recognized that a lot of the stuff that we give a lot of weight to doesn't have any meaning. That's why they created so many things designed to force you to try to find that meaning. The Bauhaus and De Stijl were trying really hard to find meaning by simplifying stuff and expressing it with geometry. With surrealism, what people were trying to do is step away from all those modes of trying to find meaning and trying to get you to think about the stuff that is just beyond what words can describe. And so even though we talked about this a little bit initially when we were looking at let's see, I'm sorry. When we were talking about how to find meaning in art, this has a lot to do with the mindset of the people that developed the surrealist perspective.
I started analyzing paintings as a way to confront the problem of not engaging with certain forms and genres of art. I mean, you stand at a museum, look at a Kandinsky or a Monet or a Seurat, and wonder, what exactly am I supposed to feel here? Certain paintings seem particularly stubborn, unwilling to move even an inch in your direction, leaving you with a massive void to fill with unanchored interpretation. But what about paintings that do the opposite? Rene Magritte's The Treachery of Images moves more than an inch in the direction of the viewer. It goes all the way. The painting speaks in a language that we can understand, which is to say, language itself. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. The painting actually says something. It engages. It talks. So what's it trying to say? First, let's talk for a moment about Rene Magritte, one of the most famous and lasting of the surrealist artists. A man who never really thought of himself as a painter, more a thinker that used images to express himself. Once he landed on an aesthetic style, it never really changed or evolved throughout his career. Well-versed in philosophical writing from Plato to Foucault, he used that style to investigate ideas. His program was to confuse, to evoke mystery, to show us that what we want is always behind the thing we see, and that the obstruction can never be removed completely because it's not in the object, it's in vision and thought itself. The Treachery of Images approaches these themes directly. The painting at first is obvious in its message. It shows an image of a pipe, and then underneath the image, it tells or reminds the viewer that this is not a pipe. And we can infer the rest. Obviously, that's not a pipe, it's a representation of a pipe. And Magritte means to show us that representations are not the real thing, they only resemble the real thing. But of course, that's common sense. Who in the world would argue the opposite position? But a curious question comes out of this. If someone showed you this image and asked you what it was, what would you say? Probably you'd say, it's an apple, right? Or what about this image? It's a man. Or this is a train. This is a house. This is a dog. This is a hand. This is a pipe. This little accident of language is not really an accident at all. For many hundreds of years, human beings have supposed that language and reality had an organic relationship, that the names of things, in a way, arose out of the things themselves, that a tree was, in fact, a tree, that Kanye West is, in fact, Kanye West, and that a pipe is really a pipe. All of that was challenged by the famous linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, an extremely influential figure who saw that a thing and its name have a totally arbitrary relationship, that we don't really know things, but only access their shadow through language, in which everything has a meaning in the context of the system. After so many centuries of trusting the word implicitly, these insights were hard won. So hard won that Magritte saw that the old, wrong-headed ways of thinking about language were still hiding in the way we thought and talked about images. Realistic painting plays on resemblance, and resemblance suggests a hierarchy, that the image of a pipe resembles, that it points outside language to the thing in itself. The falseness of this claim is what inspired the abstract artists to move beyond resemblance into a field in which painting had no referent in reality as such. Magritte, on the other hand, makes this point using the false premises of resemblance and shatters them from within. The visual secret dependence on language is laid bare in the treachery of images. Indeed, that dependence is the treachery of images. Here we have an image and a sentence laid out like a page from a botanical textbook, begging to be connected. But why should we connect them? Why should the sentence and the image refer to one another? How do we know that the word "this" points upward? Of course, we don't know. But the pronoun, the resemblance, and the name all make that connection inevitable. And it's that inevitability that's made real in every aspect of our lives. We go about our days confident that everything we see could be said and that the images we say could be seen. But if you've ever used the phrase, "you had to be there," you know that these are two realities that do not overlap in the way we act like they do. This is not a pipe, yes. But this is not a pipe either. And if this is not a pipe, then the sentence scrawled in its cute schoolboy cursive is actually a contradiction that pulls the whole painting apart at the seams and makes it utter nonsense. I don't know if Magritte laughed about that, but I hope he did. Because what's more forceful, not moving an inch in the direction of the viewer, or moving a question all the way into the center of the viewer's mind, that on the slightest prodding and examination implodes?
What do you think about that?
It's very contrived.
What is interesting to me is the Surrealists emerge in a time period where the survivors of World War I are rebuilding the world. So this is significantly past World War I. But in this, we have several different art movements that are exploring the ideas that there is some sort of value to exploring meaning. And it becomes really interesting to me that you have Magritte painting this, but then you also have a lot of people painting dream images. They're not necessarily painting things that are abstractions of the world around them. They're not painting geometric abstractions necessarily. They're painting things that are designed specifically to evoke emotional imagery, to access the subconscious. And this is why it's called surrealism. It's under realism. It's not intended to be abstract. It's not intended to be geometric. It's not intended to be anything other than something that invites us to explore those liminal spaces in our own consciousness, that invites us to explore the numinous presence we might feel. And like Dada, they invite us to explore the assumptions that we make about meaning And I think that's absolutely fascinating. The same thing kind of thing happens after World War II as well. We see that quite a bit. I included a link to the Surrealist Manifesto, which I think is really fascinating as well. And one of the reasons I think it's fascinating is that as you read it, it is astonishingly self-referential and labyrinthine in its reasoning. It ties to itself. It ties into itself. It argues. Reading it is almost like chasing meaning in the same way that a dog would chase its own tail. You know, every time you try to get closer, the tail moves away because it's, you know, part of you as well. And it's really fascinating to me that the Surrealist Manifesto reads like surrealism as well, where they step away from the immediate relationship with reality that we expect and start opening doors to the subconscious. Now, I don't want to watch this video. There is a trigger warning. This it contains imagery from a film that was done by the guy who did the melting clocks, Salvador Dali. He did a number of films, and he even did some stuff with Walt Disney. And we may watch. I'd like to watch that one before we go. But Doctor Who, Peter Garibaldi, is the guy who introduces this. But definitely watch this. And I give you the trigger warning is really disgusting, but it's 337 to 345. Just skip over that really fast. But I do recommend that you watch that. And
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Why did all of these art movements feel they needed to write a manifesto? Like, this is like 4 movements now that have a manifesto.
Well, this is an indicator of the time period. The written word today, in a lot of respects, is cheapened because anybody can get their thoughts out with TikTok or video. And until it became not only free, but completely socially acceptable and expected to do that, the written word still carried quite a bit of weight, I think. And even more when printing was difficult. And so in the 19th century, magazines were essentially designed as platforms to publish books chapter by chapter. And after you got the whole story, you would take that portions of the magazines, send them to a binding house, and they would bind it into a book for you. So, you know, this idea of the presentation of the word and the physical presence of the word was very important. And so, and that was really the only way. I mean, that was essentially the social media of the time. There was no other way to get your word out. And so up even until about 1970s and beyond, you know, even more recent than that, many artist movements, as part of their formative structure and unifying platform, would create a manifesto. The Cubists did a manifesto. The Expressionists, their manifestos for Expressionists. For the abstractionists, there's manifestos. The Italian Futurists we saw, that Bauhaus had it, Dada had them, and there were a lot. As we get closer to the Depression and World War I or World War II, some of these groups were less cohesive. They heard about each other. They responded to things in a similar way, but they didn't communicate and have salons or group meetings like the Dadaists and the Cubists and Bauhaus guys were doing. And then the manifesto, instead of a group thing, becomes more of an artist thing, where every artist wants to do their own manifesto. And of course, that changes as the artist evolves. So that kind of goes out of fashion. And then by about mid 70s, it drops out almost entirely, other than the artists that create a manifesto to be somewhat ironic.
Were these manifestos like widespread? Like, did a lot of people read them, or were they like more niche?
A lot of people would write them, but not many people would read them. Okay? It's like today, everybody can write a book, and you gain notoriety for writing a book, and you go on social media and you get all these ads say, I'll give you my book for free. Nobody reads them. They produce the book. It's more important for the author to produce it than it is for people to read it. And that's but until about 1940, people actually did bother to read them. After that, a lot of people, oh great, he has a manifesto, that must mean they're serious. Nobody bothers. Do you know what I mean? The fact of the manifesto is a lot more important than whatever's in the manifesto.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, like, nowadays people still write manifestos, but people usually don't read them unless they do something like wild, like violent or something.
Nobody bothers reading it. Now, I want to share, we only have a few minutes left. I want to share this. Let's see really quick. I want you guys to look at Andre Breton and Salvador Dali. I want you to watch those videos. This is the video that from Disney. I'm thinking I will play this for everybody right now after we look at this other video. And I hope you guys stay for a couple minutes, but it will be part of the thing. And before we do that, I want to talk about this. This is an introduction of Surrealism. And again, if you keep in mind that none of the Surrealist artists were trying to show you what they were thinking. All of them are trying to get you to access your subconscious through looking at what they were doing. Like Magritte with This Is Not a Pipe is not engaging you with a direct question and answer. He's asking you to explore the very fundamental foundations of where meaning resides. And I just think this is really fascinating.
Now, many of the artists of the Dada movement will actually move on to Surrealism. And Surrealism is an interesting movement. This is an avant-garde art movement, just like...
Do you remember what avant-garde means? It's not a specific movement. What does avant-garde actually mean?
Out of the box?
No, almost, not quite. Avant is French for advance, and garde is, French for guard. So it's the advance guard. It's the people that are going forward before everybody else. And so a lot of movements are avant-garde when they step away from what everybody is expecting. And so that's why they're talking about Dada going into Surrealism.
Almost every other movement that we've looked at. And it incorporates art and literature, just like Dada would have art, literature, and theater. And it sought to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind. Now, that means that basically they're trying to dig into the unconscious. There's a few ways you can do this. It could be illustrating dreams, but you could also use drugs, or as you fall asleep, you kind of let your mind wander into an area of imagery, and you fall asleep in an armchair holding keys or a cannonball over a big metal bowl, so that as you fall asleep, you drop the keys or whatever into the bowl, makes a racket, wakes you up, you write down what you saw. These are amongst the ways that we see artists dealing with Surrealism. And they sought to explore this inner world of the psyche, really digging into the unconscious level, something that's really hard to get into. I mean, we have dreams.
Now, what Grace said was really important. Avant-garde, it means advanced guard, but these are the people that think outside the box. So that is really an important thing to think about. But I love this iceberg perception, because as we look at most of the other people that we're dealing with are dealing with a lot of these kinds of things here, asking you to think behind it. The thing that's different about Surrealism, even Dada was reflecting on things that you're familiar with, but doing it in such a way that it didn't make a lot of conscious sense. So you were forced to think about other things. But the surrealists were really focused on portraying these things that are underneath the conscious level. And that's why their paintings don't make sense. Things don't seem to relate to each other. Things, we're not talking necessarily about doing a specific window of an area, but looking at it from different perspectives and time points. We're not thinking about trying to get you to think beyond what something is by exploring the nature of expression. What we're doing is looking at things that are directly formed from dream intentionality and dream images, which I think is really fascinating.
Dreams and such. But even if you could get into it, how do you begin to communicate it? After all, how many times have you told someone a dream that had a deep impact on you, but to them, they sat there and went, really? Purple polka dot zombies and yellow dresses? That's kind of weird, man. But to you, it meant everything. And maybe I shouldn't share my dreams publicly, but still, moving on. So they want to bring the inner reality and the outer reality together. They want to make concrete that which is not. They want to bring dreams and the unconscious into sort of a conscience.
So what's interesting is that they are addressing something that is meta, that lives in that meta realm, where Dada would show things that didn't make a lot of sense to get you to think about it. The surrealists would do these kind of realistic depictions of things that could not possibly be real. And this is where the dream imagery comes in, because they're getting you to think about the things that are beyond what is perceptible.
Conscious form. So we see a lot of odd images. Now, first of all, I should point out that surrealism can find its roots in a number of different places. Not just Freud, for example, but going back as far as Romanticism. Artists like Fuseli and others who are painting dreams and nightmares. They are giving root to a lot of those ideas that will become surrealism later on. And as surrealism develops, it really focuses on that idea of trying to communicate the intangible. And it's not always dreams. We will see personal experience and other things coming out as well from artists who are more or less considered surreal. So a lot of different possibilities here, but it's all about exploring the unconscious mind.
Do you guys have a couple minutes to watch this film by that Salvador Dali and Walt Disney? Oh no, it's too long. Okay, watch this movie on your own time, and I think that'll be one of the points necessary for, attendance, to watch the Walt Disney and Salvador Dali film in this section, in the surrealism section, and then make one comment about it. But a lot of these are and it looks like I'm going to have to change this one out and find a different video. Spend a minute though looking at least the artwork by each of these artists and see what you think, because it's one of the things that I think is really fascinating about these kinds of movements that we're looking at is, do you see how like one movement will attach onto one thing, another movement will attach onto another thing, and then the next movement in line will kind of fuse the things together and build something. So we have Dada, we have Bauhaus, and we have Surrealism, because they're trying to find some way of communicating the ideas that both of those guys addressed. And I think it's really fascinating as we look forward to the different art movements that are coming up, and they're happening more and more rapidly. I think next week we're going to be talking about the Harlem Renaissance, and this is where we're going. The pendulum is swinging back to full realism again, and it's dealing with very personal issues again. So we're going to be looking at things that feel a lot more realistic again. And then we're going to go into abstract impressionism, which swings away from realism, as people are reacting to the different things that happened after the 1930s, World War II. And things just keep going back and forth. And it's fascinating to me how, in an effort to survive and thrive in an ever-changing world, the artists are exploring things that everybody is concerned with. But the artists are the first ones to actually try to articulate that visually. And I think that's fascinating. Any last observations or questions?
Nope. I did already watch the Disney and Salvador Dali movie, and it's, for lack of better words, freaky deaky.
Well, it was actually finally restored so that it could be shown about 6 or 7 years ago, I want to say. But I watched it at a gallery showing on a cruise ship. My in-laws at the time, and this I want to share this story because it was a perfect setting to watch a surreal film. My kid's mother had just decided she wanted a divorce. And so I was going to bow out of, her parents were paying for everybody to go on a cruise. And I thought, now I'm not going to go on a cruise with the person I'm no longer married to. And the kids all said, no, you've got to go because otherwise we won't go either. And then nobody will be there. So I went and we just made cabin changes and stuff like that. So it wasn't as awkward as you imagine it could be. But on that, I made friends with the on-site gallerist, who was an incredibly fascinating art historian. And he actually met with some of the people that helped to restore this movie to get it so that the cruise line could actually show this movie on their ships in their on board galleries. And it was just fascinating to hear the story about how this was originally made. And then it's actually been underground in a vault for almost 50 years before somebody accidentally found it. And then they were able to digitize it and restore it. And I just think so it is a really interesting movie, as long as you don't mind the surrealism. And I think that's unsettling for a lot of people, because they don't realize that surrealism is not people trying to show you the world as it is. They're trying to show you dream images so you can gain access to information that lives in those liminal and numinous spaces in the back of your brain. Itches that you can't quite scratch and thoughts that you can't quite articulate. And I think that's just really fascinating. Any last thoughts or questions, Sarah?
Nope. I don't think
All right.
so.
Excellent. Okay, guys, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful week and weekend. And I look forward to seeing everybody on Tuesday. Oh, one last thing. I will be submitting midterm grades tomorrow. So you'll have the midterm grades. But again, that is something just to be aware of in the back of your head, because your final grade, everything is finally due, resubmissions and everything at the end of the semester. So, get as much done now as you possibly can, because that will reflect on the midterm grade. But that's something to just be aware of, because every time you resubmit something, your grade goes up. And, just to be aware of that. All right, guys, have a great week and weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.